Hello everybody and welcome to the first edition of online drawing here at Royal Holloway. My name is Dean and I'll be your tutor for today. In today's session we're going to cover some of the fundamentals which go into a drawing. I'm going to show you how you start a drawing, but more importantly how you shade a drawing. I'm also going to show you the materials that we use when it comes to drawing, and more importantly how those materials can be used and how they affect the outcome of a particular drawing. With today's session we are going to look at turning a two-dimensional shape into a three-dimensional shape. We've got two different shapes here. We've got a pyramid and we've got a cube. With these shapes, if you can master these, you can pretty much draw anything. All of the foundations in which drawing are made up of are inside these drawings here. Drawing as a process really is made up of two parts. You've got your drawing, which gives you your structure, but you've got your shading, which gives you your surface. Without both of these in equal measure, your drawing won't look three-dimensional. One of the hardest things to do when it comes to drawing is understanding the materials you have and how they can and cannot be used. A quick talk here on paper. We've got two paper types today. Here I've got some standard printer paper, which is about 90 GSM. Paper is weighed and measured in something called GSM, which stands for grams per square metre. The smaller the GSM, this here being 90, the thinner the paper, and usually the smoother the surface. Some people prefer to work on smoother, thinner paper, so it gives you a slightly nicer finish. The downside of working on thinner paper is if you're trying to build up your tone, you can't always get the pencil in and work hard enough because you tear through the paper. On the other end of your scale, you've got something called 250 GSM paper, and this is typical cartridge, which we tend to draw on. It's a lot thicker than your 90 GSM, and it does tend to have a slightly more raised surface with a bit of tooth on there. That tooth can sometimes put people off, but it actually allows you to layer up your drawings and your shadings in a much better way. Today, I'm going to shade on some 250 GSM, but I'm also at the end going to show you what you can achieve on 90 GSM paper. When it comes to drawing, one of the hardest things to know is how to start a drawing. If you're a beginner, this can be particularly daunting. When it comes to drawing, the best thing to do is employ a technique I like to call plotting. As a technique, it's fairly straightforward and very, very simple. When you plot, you look at the object, and we can use this as an example, and you want to observe where the highest point is, where the lowest point is, and where your two widest points are. Depending on what you're drawing, these points will be different. If we look at the cube, for example, our highest point is there, our lowest point is there, and our two widest points are anywhere on those two lines. By plotting out your space in advance, you give yourself a rough idea of where your drawing sits, and it prevents you from making it too big or too small. I'll show you what plotting is in practice now. So, if I was to draw the pyramid, all I want to do is find the highest point and put a mark, then by eye roughly guess where the other points are. So I'm just going to plot the lowest point, and then after that I'm going to plot the two widest points on this shape. Now I've got these 4 points, I've got a rough idea of where my drawing needs to sit. The important thing about drawing, well, not about drawing, sorry, but about plotting, is that these aren't gospel. When you draw, it really is a process of adding and subtracting, and it's very difficult to know if your drawing's correct until you've got some sort of line and structure inside your space. With these, if your line goes above or beyond your plot points, run with it. It may look better. These are only here to start the drawing off and give you some vague idea of where it may possibly sit. Now I've got my 4 points, so I've got my highest, my lowest and my two widest. I can go in and start my drawing. With pencils, you need to know what these can achieve. What I've got here is a 2H. I've also got a 4H. I've got a HB here, and I've got a 2B pencil here. 4 different pencils which do 4 very different things. A HB pencil is a standard pencil. We've all had experience using HBs in the past, and a HB actually stands for a hard black. It's a standard pencil. On the other side of your HBs, you've got something known as your B scale, and this here is a 2B. This is 2 shades darker than my HB, but it's also 2 shades softer. Your B scale runs all the way up to 10B. The higher the number on your B, the the softer the pencil and the darker the lead. On the other side of your HBs, you've got your H scale. This here is a 2H, so it's 2 shades lighter than my HB, but it's also 2 shades, not 2 shades, sorry, but 2 pencils harder than the HB. This is 4 shades harder and lighter than a 2B, and if I look at the 4H, that is 4 shades lighter and harder than the HB. The H scale, just like your B scale, runs all the way up to number 10. The higher the number, the lighter the shade, but the harder the graphite. When it comes to sketching in general, you're best off using a HB or a pencil in your H scale. The reason for that is fairly simple. Your Bs being darker, if you make a mistake, you can't always rub it out. Your H's being lighter, if you do make a mistake, you won't really see it if you do go and erase that line. The biggest benefit of using your H's is that because they are a harder graphite, you get a much nicer quality of line when it comes to drawing. You're going to get a much sharper edge and a much more precise line. So we always want to try and sketch first off with either a 2H, 4H or a HB. So with that being said, I'm going to use my 4H to sketch this shape out. When it comes to drawing, it doesn't really matter so much where you start. As long as you start somewhere with these plot points, you're going to be on good course to get your drawing in. What I'm going to do here for this pyramid, and this is just personal preference, you can start on any line, is I'm going to sketch on my vertical line to split the shape in half. Now straight away, I've noticed that my plot mark, which is the tallest point, is too far over to the left. So rather than taking my line to meet that, I've taken it slightly over to improve the drawing. Like we said right at the start, your plotting isn't gospel. It's there just to get you started. Once I've got my central line, I can then go in and start to sketch on my base, and I take that to the widest point. I then do the same on the left-hand side, and once again, I can already see that this doesn't match up with the plot point I've put down, so I take it just below. What I now do is join both the sides up to the top line, and I've now got one side. I'm just going to mimic that on this side here. If you've got a ruler, by all means use a ruler. You're going to get a much nicer edge. When it comes to actually sketching, what you may see me do here is rather than taking my line all the way from the base right up to the top, I'm quite literally sketching the line on in dashes and building the line up. If you try and take your lines from point A to point B all in one go, it can be very, very difficult to get right. By sketching your lines up, you make it slightly easier on yourself to get your shape in. Okay guys, so we've got a rough idea of our shape and we've done it with our H pencil. This looks fairly three-dimensional already, and the reason for that is our lines at the base are pulling away from one another. It doesn't look like a flat triangle, but at the same time it's not completely three-dimensional, and we can improve this with some shading. When it comes to shading, there are some golden rules that you need to observe. One of them is that you don't ever want to shade in the centre of your surface. What I mean by that is, if I was going to shade this part of the shape, I don't want to start my shading in here. The reason for that's quite simple. If I start in the centre of my shape, I've got to blend off this side, this side, this side, and this side here. What you're best off doing is starting on an edge and working out to another edge. In doing so, effectively, you've only got one side to blend off, and you minimise the workload and make it a lot easier for yourself. When it comes to shading, another important thing to consider is following the direction of your surface. Now this, as a concept, can seem a bit bizarre and a bit hard to grasp, and it's probably easier to show you on one that's already been completed. What I mean by following the surface is that every object has a light source, and the light source dictates the way we read the surface. Here we can see that it's darker on the left-hand side and it's lighter on the right-hand side. Because of that, we know the light is coming in from the right and it's casting a shadow on the left. If you look at this, you can see that my lines, or my shades, are going across this surface from the centre out to the right. And on the left-hand side, they're coming from the left edge into the centre, but they're coming down diagonally. If you follow the direction of your surface and the direction the light's hitting your surface, you render it complete and you make it look realistic. With today's drawing, fairly straightforward. we're going to start with the left-hand side because it is in shadow and it's easier to work from dark to light. I'm going to start on an edge and I'm going to take all of my lines into the centre. The important thing to know here, our pyramid is a flat surfaced object. It's not got a curve in it. Because of that, all of our lines need to be as straight as possible when we start our shading. If you keep them straight, you give yourself a flat surface. If I curve my lines when I shade, I'll give it a curved surface and it won't look right. You see the base? It's a flat line, so it's got to be a flat surfaced object. When it comes to shading, a lot of people ask me, how do you build up a shade? Quite simply, it's the case of moving your hand back and forth and building up tone. The harder you press with a pencil, the darker the shade. The lighter you press with the pencil, the lighter the shade. It really is as simple as that. When it comes to shading, there's two ways you can predominantly shade. One of them is that you work back and forth like I just did there. You can see that now, and you may be able to hear it in the pencil. It's working back and forth. And essentially all I'm doing here is I'm making a Passover of lines which look like this. This is a good technique to use if you've got quite a big surface to fill. The downside of using this is accuracy. Because you are moving your hand back and forth, and you may be able to see it already in the sides here, it can be quite difficult to make your lines, or your shades, sorry, match up and meet your line accurately. Another technique, which is actually harder to employ, but gives you a much better shade, is to strike all of your shades in one direction. All I'm doing here, rather than working back and forth, is striking my pencil all in one direction, and to get tone, I press hard and then eventually take the pressure off the pencil to get lighter. Rather than working back and forth here, all I'm doing with my pencil is quite literally striking in one direction and I'm layering my shades up, one on top of the other. A lot harder to do, but it does give you a cleaner image as a result. Okay then guys, so now we've got that, we'll start putting this into our drawing for today. Like I said, our light source is coming in from the right, so this side needs to be darker, this side needs to be lighter. As we said at the start, our pencils all have different grades. We've sketched this with a 4H. I don't want to shade this with a 4H because it's too light. I'm going to swap over now to a HB, which is a standard pencil. I've got a funny feeling that the HB is still going to be too light here, but that's not an issue. We can always go darker, but we can't always go lighter. So, as I said guys, we'll start on this edge here and take all of our lines into the centre. And what we're going to do here is try and keep our lines as straight as possible to make sure the surface looks nice and flat. Okay, here we go. So, all I'm doing here is starting on that edge and working across in one direction to the centre. I'm pressing a little harder on the left-hand side to try and create some contrast in my shade. And as I take it across, I'm taking the pressure off ever so slightly to try and create a contrast between light and dark. It doesn't matter so much if you start at the bottom or if you start at the top. As long as you start on this line somewhere and work over, your drawing will be absolutely fine. When you take your hand off your page and you start shading again, I'll show you this once I go down to the base, it's important that you don't start on the edge that you made. If you do that, you're going to create a patchy shade, and that's not what you want. I'll quickly show you this in effect in a moment. I'm just going to take the shade up to the top. What I would say as well, guys, is don't be too concerned if you think your shades are taking too long. Shading is a lot harder than a lot of people think, and it takes a lot longer than most people think. When it comes to shading, you've really got to exercise some patience here, because without the shading, you won't have any surface in your drawing. Okay, so we've got the top third of this side done. What I was saying before was, once you take your hand off your page, you don't want to now start your shades on that edge or outside. If you do that, I'm going to create a line there, and I'm going to have one patch of shading and a second patch of shading. What I want to do here instead is work in this and come back out. Using an even pressure, I want to try and match the tone, bring it out and work it down to the bottom. So all I do is go in, press very light, and then carry the shade on and out of the shape. The whole time I'm trying to keep the pencil flat and all the lines straight. Like we said, we don't want to be curved, because if you curve them, you're going to get a curved surface. Importantly as well here, guys, as you can see, I'm not working the pencil back and forth. I am just working it all in one direction from the left-hand side into the centre. By doing that, it does take a bit longer, but the shades do look better and I'm not going outside my edges. If you do, when you're sketching and shading, go outside the edges, don't worry at all, it's not an issue. We come back in at the end and we just rub those lines out and we neaten up the drawing right at the end. What I would say at this stage as well, guys, is if you've got lines in your shades, this is a very sort of common thing which happens if you're new to shading. A lot of people get white stripes inside their shades. It's not an issue at all. There's a few ways around that. But the reason you're getting the white stripes is quite simply you're not going in and out of your shades enough. You're going down your page or your surface too quickly, and you're not building the shades one on top of the other. If you are getting white stripes in your shading, you can just go back up the surface to fill those in, or alternatively work back down the surface to fill those in. The easiest way to get around it is to actually decrease the tempo in your hand and make your shading slower. By doing so, you tend to cover those white spaces a bit better, and you can see them more clearly as well because you're working in a slower way. So just decrease the tempo rather than increase it, and if need be, work in and out of your surface and you'll make it look a bit more solid. Okay guys, so it's not looking too bad at the moment. Like I thought at the start, we're going to have to come back in and make this darker near the end because it is a little bit too light. But if you're not sure about how dark it should be, always work lighter and go darker after. The worst thing you can do is go too dark because you can't really correct that. You can always darken a drawing up, but you can't necessarily lighten a drawing up. You can of course erase it and take parts out, but you've then got to put all of the work back in. So I'd always encourage you, if you're not sure, to start lighter and build your tones up after. Okay guys, you can see here the effect we're starting to get now. Because all of the lines are travelling in a straight line, they're not curved, we've now got a slightly flat surface. I was going to continue this on now and fill in the base, and then we're going to move on to the right hand side of this object. If you're drawing this guys and you're concerned that your lines aren't straight enough, don't worry too much because there's one technique I'm going to show you at the end of this which will alleviate some of that, but you want to try and keep them as straight as you can. What I would say, if there's a noticeable curve, rub it out, go back to the edge and work in. Okay, we're nearly done with this side now. Also guys, if you're not doing it at the same pace as I am and you're slightly further up the page or you're still starting, don't worry, don't rush it. You can always rewind on this video and watch it back and take your own time with this. The last thing you want to do with anything when it comes to drawing is to rush it. If you do so, you're going to get a bad drawing out of it. Take your time and be aware that shading does take a lot longer than most people think. Okay, so one side down, we've just got the second side to go. As I said, this is still too light, so I'm going to have to go darker. But rather than doing this before I put this surface in, I'll do it at the end. The reason for that is I don't know how dark I want to go until I've got the lighter surface put on. What I said a moment ago was, if you have some curved lines in there which you're not too pleased about, there is a way you can get rid of those. All I've got here are some blending stumps. They're slightly different shapes, slightly different sizes, but they all do the same thing. All the blending stump does is soften up your shades in there and gets rid of some of the lines. With pencil drawing and shading in particular, you're never going to get a completely solid surface without some sort of line in there. It's just the way the material works. This does eliminate it to some extent. If you are going to use these, there's some rules you need to follow. If you don't have one of these, you can just use your finger and smudge blend these over. These give you a nicer finish, so I'd encourage you to purchase some of these and give these a go. With these, you must follow the direction of your surface. So we know, for example, we started on the left-hand side and worked into the centre and we kept all of the lines straight. It's the same thing with these. You don't want to be taking these in a curved motion because you're essentially undoing all of the work you've done with your shading. All I'm going to do, because it's quite a small surface, is pick up one of the finer blending stumps, and all I'm going to do is work from the base and mimic the shading I've done underneath, but just run this blending stump over the top. You may not see it in the camera. I'm going to hold it up in a moment. move over to the big one. But it does make a big difference when you do it in person. You'll see that your lines that you've created, or the streakiness in your blends, will start to disappear somewhat. Okay. So all I'm doing here, guys, is using a nice even pressure. I'm not pressing too hard. If I press too hard, I can damage the paper. I'm just working the stump back and forth over that surface, and this part now starts to look slightly softer than the top. All I'm going to do is carry this onto the top and finish off this side, and then together we will move on to the right hand side of this drawing. Okay, so I'm getting near the top, switch over to one of the smaller stumps, just makes it easier. All I'm doing here is I'm running the stump down the edge of the shape just to neaten up the edge that we've got. Okay, there we go. So that's the first side done. We need to get the right hand side on now. I do need to go darker here, but I don't want to do that until I've done the right hand side. We used a HB there, and we know this has to be darker. So rather than using a HB here, I'm going to go for a 4H, which is 4 times lighter than a HB. If you've only got a HB pencil, don't worry about it at all. It would just be a case of using as light a pressure as you can across that surface to definitely get a difference between the dark and the light. Same thing here. We want to work from this edge out to the right hand side. In doing so, I'm following the direction the light is hitting this surface. The one thing I don't want to do here, and the one thing I do need to do slightly differently, is I don't want to follow the same angle as the first drawing. If we come back to the initial sketch, we took all of our lines on this left-hand side, from the left edge into the centre at a diagonal angle. On this side, I want to take them across as flat as I can. Just take them straight across horizontally. In doing so, I effectively give the appearance of 2 separate surfaces. Although the surface itself is separated by this line, when you shade, you're essentially filling in white space. If this white space is shaded in the same direction as that, there's a chance they're going to merge and they're going to blend. By taking your lines in 2 different directions, you alleviate the chance of that happening, and you create a clear distinction between the right-hand side and the left-hand side. So 4H, 4 times lighter than the HB, same as this side. We start on the centre, and I'm going to take my lines out as straight as I can. I should say I don't really think it makes a difference if you start your shades at the top or at the bottom. It's going to be a personal preference. I'm going to start these down just above the bottom, just to get some in. And if you need to, guys, as you're working, rotate your page, by all means do. There's no reason why you can't. If by rotating it makes it slightly easier on your hand to get your shades on, by all means do it. Okay, guys. So if you've swapped over to a 4H or any H pencil, what you're going to notice is, in terms of shading, because it is a lighter pencil but a harder graphite, your lines will look a bit more scratchy, I'd say. That's probably the best way of describing it. They're going to have a slightly scratchier surface, and the reason for that is quite simply the lead is a lot harder than your HB or your Bs. If you use a B, which we're going to do at the end, you'll see the difference. What I would say about the H's, what is quite nice about them is because they are so light, they're fairly easy to blend off. If you're working with dark pencils, they can be quite hard to blend off. With your H's, because they're light, it tends to be a lot easier. Okay, guys, so a quick note here in terms of the actual blending. What I'm not doing is going from here to the end all in one go. Just like we said about our sketching when it comes to drawing the shape out. Rather than going from one point to the other point all in one go, you want to build your sketches up as well. I've seen people in the past, when they start shading, try and go from this edge to that edge all in one go and essentially draw the sketch or the shade on. It doesn't work. It's going to look too rough when it comes to the actual finished result. What you want to do is work from the edge or a line and just work over. Work over as quickly as you can. Use an even tempo and build those shades up. And like I said, if you need to rotate your page, guys, whilst you're doing this to make it easier on the hand, by all means do. From a technical standpoint, it doesn't really, or sorry, I'd say from a visual standpoint, it doesn't really make a difference. But if it does make it easier on the wrist and it makes it easier to get the shades in, by all means rotate the page any way you need to. Okay. All I'm doing here with the shades is, like I did on the left-hand side, on the line I start on, which in this case is the central line, I'm trying to go a little bit harder. And as I come over to the right, I'm trying to go a little bit lighter. By doing so, I create contrast on this surface as well, but at the end, it's going to look much better when we come in and make this completely darker compared to that. Okay. If as well, guys, when you're shading, you're starting to get very dark pockets of shading, I wouldn't be too concerned with that. The reason you're getting that is it's just a muscle memory in your wrist. You've not built up a muscle memory yet with the shading. The more you shade, the easier it is to gauge pressure, and the easier it is to keep your shades consistent. As long as you're working with an even tempo, you can typically blend off most sort of black or dark hazard shades which you've put in. It shouldn't be an issue at all. Likewise here, guys, I'm not trying to blend or bend, the shading. I'm trying to keep them as straight as possible. In doing so, you follow the direction of the surface. So here, I've got, like I said, one of those those darker and more defined areas of shading, which is slightly blacker than the shades around it. Don't worry if that's the case. At the end, we can come in with a blending stump and we can take those out and make them slightly softer. Funnily enough, when it comes to shading, it's the the shadows and the blacks that you get in your shades that make the big difference. If you go too light with your shading, it can look a little bit flat. By coming in and getting those dark tones on, you make your drawing look a bit more dynamic. Okay guys, so getting close to finishing this surface here. If you've opted for the first style of shading where you work back and forth in a zigzag, you may at this stage have shades which sit over the central line that you've got. If that's the case, don't worry about that at all. Like I said, what we're going to do near the end of this is come back in and increase the structure again with some more drawing, and we can start to strengthen things up which may have gotten lost in the early stages of this drawing. Okay, nearly done. Okay, good stuff. So, both sides now, and as we said, this is too light, so I need to go darker in here. Before I do that, I need to pick up my blending stump, because there is some lines in here. You are naturally going to get a slightly more linear patch of shading if you use a H pencil, just because they are harder. The benefit of that though, as we said, because they are light, they're a lot easier to blend and smudge off. So what I'm going to do is use this blending stump, working at the bottom, following the direction of the shading that I put down first of all, and I'm just going to strike this blending stump, which is essentially just rolled up paper, across the surface. It's just going to try and get rid of some of the lines that I created with the shading. Don't worry if it doesn't get rid of them all entirely. It may well not, but it does make things look slightly softer. All I'm doing now at the end of this is running down the edges to make sure I've filled the edges. And I've now got two surfaces which are shaded. It looks fairly three-dimensional, but it's not completed yet. This side needs to be darker because our light source is coming in from here. This is almost the same tone, if not slightly bizarrely darker than this one. So all I do here is I pick up my 2B rather than the HB. The 2B is 2 shades darker than this tone here, so we know straight away we're going to get a slightly darker looking surface here. Same thing again, we don't do anything differently. We start on an edge, I match the actual line that I've got underneath it, and I work into the central line. All I'm going to do here is start at the side and work the pencil over. I'll quickly hold this up in a moment and you'll see the difference this pencil has compared to the first one. So you should be able to see now that it is much darker than the tone underneath it. What you don't necessarily want to do is take this darkness all the way over to the centre, because it can look a bit blocky. What I want to do effectively is blend this off into the tone underneath it. If you're blending a dark pencil on top of a light pencil, it's actually a lot easier than blending a pencil on white. The reason for that is white reflects colour. If you're doing it on top of grey, it's a lot easier to blend off because the tone is similar right from the start. It might be darker, but it's a lot easier to blend off. And all I'm doing here to blend it is going lighter with the pressure as I meet the centre. And I don't even necessarily need to go all the way over to the centre. So here, I've stopped just there. I'm not taking it all the way over. And at the moment, it looks not too bad. If I wanted to, I could come from that edge in, but at the moment, it's not really required. So all I'm going to do here, guys, is carry this on up to the top I'm going to press slightly harder on that left-hand side. And as I work into the centre, I'm going to take the pressure off and try and match the tones and make them look as soft as possible. If you have switched over to a 2B, you should notice the difference immediately. It's a lot easier to get the graphite out, and it should bizarrely move a little bit more fluid across your page. The reason for that is your lead, as we say with the Bs, are softer. And if you use the 4H on that right-hand side, you'll notice the difference immediately. The H is a little bit more tough and it's a bit more stiff when you take it across the page, but your Bs, being softer, they do tend to move with ease. And that's the beauty of using these. They don't blend off as well because they are quite harsh, but they do move across your surface fairly easily. Okay, so you can see it starting to build up now. We've done the bottom half and it starts to look darker than the top half. We're now getting a contrast between the light side and the dark side. So what I'm going to do here, guys, is finish this off and carry on working up the surface. If by now, guys, your wrist is hurting, don't worry, that's natural. We've done a fair bit of shading so far, and as I said right at the start, your shading does take a lot longer than most people realise. It's quite deceptive. The drawing, in many ways, is the easy part. It's just the two-dimensional structure. It's the shading which gives us our surface that really renders your drawing 3D. All I'm doing here, guys, is I'm running my pencil back up that edge, just to reaffirm where I want to start my shades. If your line is slightly soft and hazy, by all means, run the pencil up the edge of the line, re-establish where it is, and then take your shades from that line out into the centre. Okay, just blending that side off into the centre now, and then working back up to the top. Like I said, if you've not got any other pencil than a HB, you can achieve all of this still, but you just have to press harder with your pencil if you came back in for a second layer. Using just a single pencil is actually quite good practice because it really does make you have to learn the pressure points in your pencils and getting your shades and your blends out just with one pencil. So it's not a bad thing at all, but to make life easier, if you invest in a couple of different graded pencils, you can achieve a lot more with a lot less hassle. Okay guys, so I'm just coming up to the top now. Okay, so we've now got a darker side and a lighter side. If you want to, you can come in from this edge and darken it up slightly. I'll do that just across this edge here, just to make it slightly darker. As long as I start on an edge and I work into the space, rather than starting in the space and working out to an edge, you won't have any problems at all. Okay, so you can see the difference now between this and that. So all I'm going to do is rotate the page, and I'm just going to work this up that side and blend the pencil in. At the end, if I need to make it slightly softer, I can pick up that blending stump and make it look a little bit more solid. Then I think we're okay. I might get away with it here. Now, because I've got quite a lot of surface already shaded in, and I'm not really looking for sort of the detail, you might be able to hear it in the pencil. I'm working it back and forth. So rather than striking it in one direction like we have so far, all I want to do here is fill this space. So I'm going to work back and forward just to get the actual tone out of the pencil and not worry too much about the edge, because I'm going to re-establish that at the end. It's the same thing again, guys. Starting from an edge, and I'm working into the centre. Even though I'm working on the opposite edge now, the angle of my shade hasn't changed. It's still the same angle as this line into the centre. The angle never changes. If you have two different angles in one surface, it can throw the eye off slightly. Okay, so all I'm going to do here, just to make it slightly softer, is come in with that blending stump once more and smooth everything off. I'm just going to run that down the centre so I can fill in any white space that I've left. And we've now finally got a darker surface and a lighter surface. Like I said right at the start, When it comes to your drawing, it's made up of two parts. You've got your structure, which comes from the drawing itself, and you've got your surface, which comes from the shading. Naturally, with drawing, you lose your structure throughout the process of shading. The reason for that's fairly simple. You're putting a lot of grey up to a line. You're naturally going to lose that line or soften it throughout the process of drawing. So right at the end, all you want to do is come back on top with a pencil and reintroduce all of your edges. We sketched this out with a H, I believe it was the 4H. If I came in here now with the 4H, you won't see it across that dark line because that 2B is 6 times darker than the 4H. When it comes to introducing your structure, you're best off using your HB pencil. It's both hard, but the B of course stands for black, so you get the best of both worlds out of this. All I'm going to do here is use a ruler to neaten up these edges, and for no particular reason, I'm going to start on the darkest line and put that on. So all I'm doing here is with the HB, coming down that line, trying to match the tone, so I'm pressing quite hard, and I'm putting that line back on. Straight away, we've re-established the structure, and that side and that edge looks a little bit better. I'll do the same now for the bottom. So all I'm going to do here is match the tone to the top one, using the HB pencil still. I'm going to take that across. There we go. You can see the base now is starting to look a little bit better on that left-hand side. Same thing for the left central line. I'm going to use the HB and I'm going to make it the same darkness as the other two lines. There we go. Now, for the ones that are lighter, I need to go slightly lighter here. This was done with a 4H. I don't want to go so light as a 4H because I want to see the edge, so I'm going to go for a 2H, which is 2 times lighter than a, 2 times darker than a 4H. So all I do here is come back down the surface. Don't want to press too hard because I don't like to be too garish. It's slightly lighter than the ones on the dark surface. And all I'm going to do here is the same thing on the base. There we go. So there you have it, guys. You've got a shape which will start as a 2-dimensional surface, which we've now rendered into a 3-dimensional surface. If you want these drawings to have a bit more pop, what you can do is put in a little horizon, and then with any pencil, let's go for 2B, you can start to sketch on a surface in which it sits. In doing so, you just give it a little surface and a bit of an anchor for it to stand up from. There you have it, guys. You've got a 3-dimensional shape. So I'm going to show you how you do that really quickly in your cube. When it comes to a cube, slightly harder. If you've not got 2 surfaces, you've got 3. So you've got 1 more than we did in the previous one. When it comes to your cube, same principles apply. You want to start in the darkest surface first. Our light source in this one is coming from here. So all I'm going to do for this cube is use a 2B in this surface here and take my lines from this edge over. Next up is this surface, which is slightly lighter. So for this surface, you would use a HB, and you want, as we said, your lines to be going in different directions in each surface. They don't merge. In this one, you would take your lines from the top or the bottom. It's entirely up to you. And you would run them down with a HB. Your top, directly in the line of your sun. That needs to be the lightest. So we don't use a 2B or a HB. With this, it can be a 2H or a 4H. It's entirely up to you. With this one, we take our lines straight across. They don't want to come down or at an angle because they have to be a different angle to these 2 surfaces here. So all we do with this one, if we're going to try this later on, is you take your lines all the way across and you flatten out that top. As long as you've got a 2H, a HB and a 2B, you're in good stead there. And what they look like at the end, hopefully, is a pyramid, which is darker on one side, lighter on the other, and a cube, which is darker on the right surface, slightly lighter on the left, and then lightest on the top. Once you've mastered these principles and these basic techniques, you can then move into more advanced things and put into practice this shading technique into real life objects, such as an apple here, And also you can move further into segmented objects which have got slightly more surfaces, such as a pepper here. As long as you know the difference between the pencil grades, how they're used and where you start with them, there's nothing you can't achieve with pencils. Brilliant guys, thanks for joining me today. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take some photographs of these, and they should be available on YouTube for you to sort of download and work from as a starting point. Thanks again guys.